Welcome back to Inside the Courtroom, the Chad-Daybell trial. We are here for this episode of this online podcast that we're going to be sharing with you throughout the course of this trial. On trial is Chad Daybell, the husband of Lori Vallow Daybell, who was convicted almost just at a year ago, convicted in the deaths of her two children, JJ and Tylee. And now Chad Daybell stands trial. It begins today. So we've seen jury selection over the past few days. They have now seated 10 men and 8 women who will sit in the jury box and listen to weeks, what we expect to be 6 to 8 weeks of testimony in this trial. And Chad Daybell, who is 55 years old now, he is charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud for the misuse of insurance money that he collected after his wife Tammy Daybell's death. And we are going to hear testimony throughout this time about what happened in the days and weeks leading up to the deaths of those 3 people. That is at the core of what this trial is about. There has been lots and lots of speculation, lots and lots of questions, even after the conclusion of Lori Vallow Daybell's trial last year. There is still a lot unknown. A lot of information, a lot of holes in the story that we don't know. But here's what we do know. Let's recap a little bit about what we do know based on the trial last year. We know that in September of 2019, 2 children, Tylee Ryan, who was 16, and JJ Vallow, who was 7, disappeared. They were in Lori Vallow Daybell's custody, in her care, and they disappeared. And she wasn't willing to answer questions about where they were. She was with Chad Daybell at the time. Now, you may have heard they've called him a doomsday prophet. Certainly, friends of the family did testify about some of the unique, unusual religious beliefs that this couple shared, talking about being able to see dark spirits, needing to save people from these dark spirits, evil spirits, knowing when people who were what they called zombies, and needing to help in that, somehow intervene in that. They talked about a biblical apocalypse coming. So that's where they get that name, and that's why some people have called this the Doomsday Trial or Doomsday Cult Trial. It's related to Chad Daybell, who himself was a self-published author who spoke a lot about the end of time and kind of what would happen when the apocalypse happened, his role in that, potentially kind of a self-proclaimed prophet. So we know that these 2 children went missing in September 2019. In October of 2019, Chad Daybell's wife, Tammy, was found dead. He reported her dead in their home in eastern Idaho. And at the time, her death was ruled a death by natural causes. Actually, after that, a few months later, it wasn't until December that authorities, based on information that they have now gathered while looking for those 2 missing children, they determined that Tammy's death may in fact instead be suspicious. Her body was exhumed in December of 2019 based on some of those questions, some of that speculation, and authorities then ruled that she had instead been suffocated. Her death was ruled a death by asphyxiation. And now Chad Daybell was at the center of that investigation. How did Tammy die? Was he responsible? It wasn't until they found the bodies of JJ and Tylee Ryan on Daybell's property in June of 2020 that they made the arrest of Chad Daybell. It was then he was arrested on suspicion of murder because there were 2 bodies now on his property, those 2 missing children found buried in his yard. One of them burned beyond recognition. The other, JJ, the young boy, was bound. We heard gruesome testimony last year about how he was bound, duct tape around his mouth, duct tape around his hands, still wearing his pajamas. It was Tylee Ryan's body that was burned so badly that they weren't able to determine what her actual cause of death was. JJ's death was ruled also death by asphyxiation or suffocation. So these are the lives that are in question during this trial, and we expect it to be a long trial. We expect it to be longer than the trial last year that convicted Lori Vallow Daybell on all charges. She has since been convicted, and she has since been sentenced to life in prison, 5 life sentences. So that means she will serve the rest of her natural life in prison without the possibility of parole. She also is facing additional charges in Arizona for the deaths of a former husband. So this case will hinge on whether or not Chad Daybell was responsible in any way for the deaths of those 2 children and for his wife Tammy. And after her death, did he fraudulently misuse her insurance money? And so that's what we're going to be watching. So what to expect from this trial, a little bit different than what we saw with Lori Vallow Daybell. During her trial, cameras were not allowed in the courtroom. The judge ruled that he was not going to let media access that courtroom. He did not want pictures or video to be shared from inside the courtroom. So we had an artist in the courtroom and shared sketches with you. This one will be different. Chad Daybell, the defendant himself, said he does want cameras in the courtroom. He does want his family in other parts of the country to be able to watch this trial. And the judge, Stephen Boise, he has allowed that. But what we will have is a court-determined field of view. So it will be, think of it like a Zoom call. That's essentially how this is going to be shared. It's going to be online, but the camera angles, the way that the camera is used, will be at the full discretion of the court. So we will not have control or power over what we see, when we see it, how we see it. It will be up to the judge to determine what that looks like. Right now, we believe that we will have a view from, looking at the judge, hearing the judge. We also believe we will be able to see from the judge's perspective, looking out at the defendant and the prosecutor's table there, like you see in a courtroom. So we expect to see that. We expect it to be streamed throughout the day, throughout this trial. Now, there's always the chance that the judge will determine that a certain witness or certain testimony, the type of information being shared may be ruled too much, right, too gruesome. Protecting a witness's identity, as an example, could be a reason that the judge determines that he will shut that feed off. Again, we won't have any control over that, but we will certainly be there and keep you updated as those things happen. We will hope to explain all of that to you as the trial goes on. So the other thing that is very different about this case is that this is a death penalty case. So different than Lori Vallow Daybell. If you remember, death penalty was not an option at her sentencing. This time, it will be. And that will be a unique situation because it extends the trial. There will be a sentencing phase where jurors will determine if the circumstances are there. There are certain aggravating circumstances by Idaho law that must be true in order for a judge to sentence a defendant to the death penalty. And it will be up to those jurors to decide that, whether or not those exist. Also must show reckless indifference. So if there is a murder conviction, that's when we will move into a death penalty phase or a sentencing phase where more testimony will be shared, more information will be shared. The defense will have an opportunity to offer mitigating circumstances to balance that out or try to prove that the death penalty is not appropriate in this case. So that's why we do expect this trial to take some time. The Doomsday Prophet on trial for three different deaths and also fraud related to those deaths, conspiracy related to those deaths. We expect to see many of the same witnesses that we saw in Lori Vallow Daybell's case. So it will be in some ways a repeat. However, we have to remember that they are going to try to determine, the defense attorney is going to try to prove that Chad Daybell wasn't responsible. So what will be interesting is to see if they point the finger back at Lori Vallow Daybell, who already is convicted. And if in that way they somehow try to argue that Chad Daybell is not responsible, that instead the responsibility lies solely in Lori Vallow Daybell. So we will have to watch and see how the testimony plays out and what strategy the defense attorneys use to share that story and try to paint that picture of who Chad Daybell really is and why these two children were found dead on his property and why his wife was found dead in his home, later ruled death by suffocation. They will have to explain how that can happen on his watch, on his property, and hope that they are looking, obviously, to try to get an acquittal, while prosecutors are going to be doing the exact opposite, looking at all of the evidence, presenting all of the information, why they believe that Chad Daybell is, in fact, responsible for these crimes. They were both, Lori Vallow Daybell and Chad Daybell, both indicted by a grand jury on these charges. That means that someone, that grand jury definitely heard information, heard testimony that they believed determined that he was in fact responsible and that there was enough information for him to be charged with these crimes. And so we expect all of that to play out over the next several weeks in this Ada County courtroom. We are going to have reporters in the courtroom. You are going to be able to watch the trial on KTVB.com. Again, being streaming from the courtroom with whatever access that the jury or that the judge allows us, Judge Boyce allows us. We expect that to be most of the trial for most of those days. We don't expect much to be quiet or to be closed off to us. We expect to have full access, and we will certainly be watching that along with you. You can watch on KTVB.com. And then here on Inside the Courtroom, we're going to make sure we bring you the insight and the explanation of what's going on during this trial. That's what we do here, and we hope you will join us for that. If, while you're watching, you have questions, you can share those with us. You can send those questions to us, and we will get those answers to you. You can text us at 208-321-5614. Texting us there, you can get those questions to us, and we will answer those on our next episode of Inside the Courtroom. So we have the jury seated, and the very next step is opening statements, and that happens today. So that marks the official start of this trial. We're going to bring you those opening statements, and then we will be here throughout the days bringing you inside look at exactly what the testimony is and what it means for Chad Daybell, the 55-year-old man on trial, multiple counts of murder and insurance fraud and conspiracy to commit murder. It is undoubtedly going to be an emotional trial. There's going to be lots of testimony, and we're going to bring it all to you right here on Inside the Courtroom.
2 dead children buried in the defendant Chad Daybell's backyard in September of 2019. The next month, his wife is found dead in their marital bed. 17 days after the death of his wife, Tammy Daybell, this defendant is photographed laughing and dancing on a beach in Hawaii at his wedding. It's Lori Vallow, a woman who was his mistress and the mother of the children, buried in the graves on his property. 3 dead bodies. This defendant believed he had a right beyond the ordinary. When he had a chance at what he considered his rightful destiny, he made sure that no person or no law would stand in his way. His desire for sex, money, and power led him to pursue those ambitions. And this pursuit led to the deaths of his wife and Lori's 2 innocent children. Chad Daybell is an author who wrote books about the apocalypse. During this trial, you will hear a story more troubling, and the story is real. Chapter 1. The defendant was a seemingly ordinary man. You'll see that he craved significance. He worked in journalism, and he worked as a sexton in a graveyard. He married his wife Tammy in 1990 after meeting at Brigham Young University, and they settled in Utah. As a full-time homemaker and mother, Tammy's love for her family was boundless. Together, Tammy and the defendant started a small publishing company. which Tammy supported in many ways. They had 5 children together. They moved to Idaho, where Tammy became a beloved school librarian. She was devoted to service, her community, and her faith. But for this defendant, that ordinary existence was not enough. Chapter 2. Lori Vallow was a homemaker from Arizona. Your Honor, this mic just.
Sorry, Mr. Lee. Let's see if we get a replacement mic.
I think I got it working now.
Okay,
I noticed that the PowerPoint is not up.
yeah, I think your mic's off. Yeah,
Okay, I didn't turn it off this time, so
you might have a bad battery. You want to confirm the screen as well?
Your Honor, it's up on the screen and it's plugged into the HDMI. I'm not sure why it's not. Transfer. I don't know if there's any one person out at that.
Let's see if we can get some help to maybe see if we can get the signal to work on that.
Sorry. Can I proceed?
Yeah, but I'm still not sure on the mic. Is that not working?
Check.
Okay, thanks.
Apologies for the interruption, writing down. Chapter 2. Lori Vallow was a homemaker from Arizona. She was married to her 4th husband, Charles Vallow, and she was the mother to Tylee Ryan and JJ Vallow. Tylee was a normal, vibrant teenage girl. She loved her friends. You'll hear that she loved her Jeep. She loved Chipotle. She loved her little brother, JJ. JJ was a 7-year-old boy on the autism spectrum. He required extensive special care needs. He loved his sister. You'll hear about a pivotal date that set in motion the deaths of Tammy, Tylee, and JJ. October 26th, 2018. That was the day when Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow met at a religious conference in St. George, Utah, where they were introduced by a mutual acquaintance. At this time, both still married to other spouses. That introduction set in motion the reality you're going to hear about. We know what happened next through the defendant's own words. You'll hear. Though both married, Chad and Lori began to have an affair. You will hear excerpts from the defendant's extended text messages to Lori that reveal his mindset and his motivations. In his thirst for sex, power, and money, Chad created an alternate reality where they called themselves James and Elena, names that Chad claimed were from past lives they had put together. The defendant's text messages reveal their story of lust and their plan for a future together. Chad Daybell wrote that upon meeting Lori Vallow, he experienced a happiness unmatched by anything else in his 50 years. He was captivated by her appearance, so much so he said she was out of his league. You will hear evidence in his own words, how he was taken by her beauty and spoke about their sexual encounters on many occasions. More than anything else, Chad's obsession with Lori was rooted in her adoration for him. She was the mirror reflecting the grandeur he saw in himself. He called her an exalted goddess. He told her in writing that she had returned to earth to perform a special mission. And part of that mission included being with him. They soon came together and turned their dreams into a plan for the future, one free from what they called obstacles. And those obstacles were Tylee, JJ, and Tammy. Chapter 3. You'll hear that in the world that Chad and Lori planned for themselves, They identified those who stood in the way of their dream as dark. Their spouses, Lori's own children, and any who opposed them were labeled sometimes as dark spirits or even zombies. This was more than an alleged belief of right-wing labor. The evidence will show that it was a convenient narrative that dehumanized people who stood in their way and who were labeled as obstacles. This narrative gave them the pretext to remove people from this world for their own good. Chad and Lori preached that only through spiritual intervention, what they sometimes called casting, sometimes through burning, or even through death, that these dark spirits be cleansed. Enter Alex Cox, Lori's devoted brother. Chad and Lori manipulated Alex with promises of spiritual rewards. They wielded their influence over Alex, drawing him into their plotting and planning of their own future. After the deaths of Tylee, JJ, and Tammy, chad-daybell gave Alex a blessing. This blessing was reported by Lori, who was present. And in that blessing, he said to Alex, "You have earned the privilege to be a member of their exclusive religious group." And he also said to him, "You have already assisted us in ways that can never be repaid." But you will also see other text messages. Chad and Lori discussed more earthly concerns, that Alex could be the one to implicate them. Alex knew this as well. Shortly before he died, on December 12th, 2019, he told his wife, Zulema Pastenis, who you will hear from, he was afraid he was going to be Chad and Lori's fall guy. Chapter 4. Once their calculated plan was devised, it only took months to execute and remove perceived obstacles in chad-daybell's path to a new life. Charles Vallow, Lori's husband, who was labeled as dark by the defendant, was shot and killed by Alex Cox in Arizona. Lori stood to gain $1 million, money that could fund Chad and Lori's future. Yet following Charles's death, Lori Vallow awaited a $1 million life insurance payout that never came, only to learn that the beneficiary was no longer her. Upon learning she would not receive that insurance money, Lori would text Chad, "I'll still get the $4,000 a month from SS, meaning Social Security." Chad replied to her in a text that read, "It will be interesting to see if it got changed after he had 2 bullets in his chest." Tylee Ryan, also branded dark and a zombie, was last seen on September 8th, 2019. Subsequent investigations revealed the horrifying truth. Her remains, charred and dismembered, were found in a grave on chad-daybell's property. Without Charles's $1 million in insurance money to support them, Lori Vallow continued to illegally receive Tylee's Social Security benefits, provided after the death of Tylee's biological father, who had been Lori's 3rd husband. According to this defendant, JJ Vallow, Lori's son, was also possessed. After he was labeled as a dark entity, his fate was no less tragic than his sister's. His young life was also planned. Later, his bound body was discovered buried in Chad's backyard, his death by suffocation. Yet while JJ was missing, Lori continued to illegally receive JJ's Social Security benefit, money provided by Charles Vallow's dad. Tammy Daybell, a vivacious, healthy mother, was another individual labeled as a dark spirit to be removed. On October 9th of 2019, she reported being shot at night near her home by a man covered in black. She thought it was a paintball gun. On October 19th, 10 days later, she died in her own home with her husband present. This was soon after an increase in the value of her life insurance to more than $400,000. This defendant rapidly cashed in that life insurance and began looking for condos in Hawaii with Lori. You'll see the rental application he submitted for a couple with no kids. Medical examiners would later determine that the only reasonable explanation for Tammy's death was not of natural causes, but rather a homicide. In fact, you will hear from multiple witnesses that Chad predicted multiple times that Tammy would die in early death. Chapter 5. 17 days after his wife's death, Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow got married and celebrated on a beach in Hawaii, Hawaii, symbolizing what he called their eternal union. Chad and Lori were preparing their wedding well before Tammy's death. Lori was shopping for wedding rings while Tammy was still alive. Now, without the earthly obstacles of spouses and young children, and with Tammy's insurance policy and the children's social security funds, they could live the life that Chad and Lori wanted. Nothing was going to stand in their way. Chapter 6. Unfortunately for this defendant, reality soon shattered their bliss. Two things led law enforcement to his and Lori's door. On October 2nd, 2019, Lori Vallow's nephew-in-law, a man named Brandon Boudreaux, was shot at in Arizona by someone from what he believed was Tyler's Jeep. Law enforcement in Arizona investigating Brandon's shooting contacted law enforcement in Fremont County, Idaho, to look for Alex Cox and for Tyler's Jeep. And you'll hear that that Jeep was later found in Rexburg, Idaho, in Madison County. Meanwhile, J.J. Vallow's grandmother, concerned that she hadn't seen or heard from him in months, asked police for help. The police followed up and located Lori in Rexburg, Idaho, where the police did a welfare check at Lori's apartment. Law enforcement arrived at Lori's door on November 26, 2019. When asked about Lori, Chad first told law enforcement he didn't know her very well, despite the fact that they were married and had been in a relationship for over a year. Lies by Lori to police about JJ and Tylee's whereabouts, and then a move to Hawaii, and Lori's unwillingness to present her children to law enforcement to prove their well-being led to her arrest and extradition. As Lori refused to produce her children, law enforcement continued their search for Tylee and JJ. During that search, they located a unique text message that this defendant, Chad Daybell, had sent to his wife, Tammy, on September 9, 2019, which was the day after Tylee Bryant's last known appearance. You'll hear from the FBI agent who found that message, that this message seemed longer than his usual text to Tammy, and it had a more conversational tone. In that text, Chad claimed he'd had an interesting morning, that he'd shot a raccoon, that he'd buried it in what they called the pet cemetery, and that he'd had a fire on the property where he burned some wood debris. When law enforcement finally went to the defendant's property the following June, they didn't find a raccoon. They found Tylee's burnt remains that were buried in the pet cemetery. And they found JJ nearby, buried under a tree near a pond. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been told this would be a lengthy trial. You will hear from many witnesses. You will hear a lot of evidence. You're going to hear a lot of dates. The following is just a timeline of major events to help understand when these things took place. October 26, 2018, Chad and Lori meet in St. George, Utah. July 11, 2019, Charles Vallow, Lori's husband, is shot and killed by Alex Cox. Between August 31st and September 1st, Lori, Alex Cox, and Tylee and JJ moved to Rexburg, Idaho, just a few miles south of the defendant's home. Tylee's last known sighting was September 8, 2019. The text I just spoke of about the raccoon was sent by the defendant to his wife September 9th, 2019. JJ's last known sight you'll hear about September 22nd. The attempted homicide of Brandon Boudreaux in Arizona was October 2nd. The shooting I mentioned of Tammy, the shooting at her, the unsuccessful shooting, October 9th, 2019. Tammy's death, October 19th, 2019. 17 days later, Chad and Lori married in Hawaii. Law enforcement did a welfare check looking for JJ November 26, 2019 in Rexburg, Idaho. November 26th and 27th, Chad and Lori leave town. June 9th, 2020, Tylee and JJ's remains are found on Chad's property. As I said, you're going to hear a lot of evidence from a lot of witnesses. And there's going to be kind of different groups of evidence you're going to hear from. You'll hear from law enforcement, some of whom will give you a broad overview of the investigation and what they did, how the search for Tylee and JJ drew them to a case of murder. You'll hear how it began by people who knew Lori and Chad, the James and Elena. You'll hear about the James and Elena story and about their relationship with each other and how they pursued their dream, their plan for a life together. You'll hear in the defendant's own words, people referred to as obstacles, how they need to be gotten rid of. You're going to hear financial evidence. You'll hear from an FBI forensic accountant and a detective, a Social Security administrative investigator who will talk about the finances involved in this case. You'll hear more from law enforcement, from multiple law enforcement agencies, the Rexburg Police, the Fremont County Sheriff's Department, the FBI, Social Security Administration, about the investigation into these crimes. You will see forensic evidence. You'll see DNA testing to identify the body of Tylee. You'll see DNA testing that showed that DNA from Tylee was found on at least 2 tools in the defendant's shed. You'll hear digital evidence dealing with geolocation data tied to certain phones that were used in this case. You'll hear from Hawaii law enforcement about searches they performed in Hawaii on the defendant and his wife. And finally, you will hear many of this defendant's own words. You will hear voice recordings of this defendant. You'll hear, recorded phone calls between him and his wife, Lori Daybell. You'll read multiple texts that he and Lori sent back. Another text he sent. Chapter 9, what's unwritten. The defendant stands before you today, charged with multiple crimes. First-degree murder for the death of Tammy Daybell. First-degree murder for the death of Tylee Ryan. First-degree murder for the death of JJ Ballo. Conspiracy to commit murder of Tammy Daybell. Conspiracy to commit murder and grand theft by deception, the death of Tylee Ryan. Conspiracy to commit murder and grand theft by deception for the death of JJ Ballo, and insurance fraud. Two dead children buried in this defendant's backyard. The next month, his wife dead in their bed. 17 days later, this defendant marries Lori Ballo. Members of the jury, days or probably weeks from now, when the evidence in this trial is fully unfolded, we will have the opportunity to speak with you again. And at that time, we will ask you to end this horrible narrative. Your verdict will be the link that writes the final chapter of this tragic saga. chapter that delivers justice for Tammy, justice for JJ, and justice for Tyler. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As an introduction, I'm John Pryor. I'm the defense attorney for Mr. Daybell. And I'm from Meridian, Idaho. I'm an attorney from Meridian, Idaho, over here on the west side of the state. I want to talk to you a little bit today. And at my age, video presentations are not something that would come easy to me. So I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about my view of the case and the facts and evidence. And what's important are facts and evidence. I think that when we went through the jury selection process, we talked about facts and we talked about evidence. And the judge gave you an instruction to talk to you a little bit about you take into consideration the facts of this case and not be distracted by other things. Don't be distracted by speculation. Don't be distracted by guesses or assumptions or hunches. It all comes down to facts and evidence. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the facts and evidence in this case. Chad Daybell, and I'm learning this, and I've had some time to learn about this because it didn't come natural to me. But Chad Daybell went on what is called a mission early on in his life. And I guess what a mission is, and I'm not familiar with that, but I guess what a mission is they go away to a location and they talk to people about their religious beliefs. And Chad's faith, that was important as part of his faith. And when they return from these missions, they start the process of moving on with their lives. And when Chad got back from doing his mission in New Jersey, he met Tammy Daybell. Another fact that I discovered, and you'll hear a little bit about, is that Chad had an extended engagement, had an extended by his faith standards romance before they got married. Chad and Tammy dated for approximately 6 months. And what I understand is by their nature, 6 months is an extended dating process before you end up getting married. So after 6 months, they got married. They were married in Utah and proceeded then to have children. They have 5 children, now all 5 adult children. At some point, they moved back here to Idaho, or moved to Idaho, and they started a small publishing company. And you'll hear testimony that the publishing company was predominantly run by Tammy. Tammy managed it. Tammy was the brains behind the company. And Tammy basically took the reins and did everything that was necessary to move this publishing company. It was a small publishing company, a very small publishing company. And what they did is basically publish books. Chad would write these books, and he would write these books about his religious experiences. In his faith, he had certain beliefs, the faith that he practiced. You know, when he went on his mission, when he, read his interpretation of the books that he used for his faith, he started writing books about things that were consistent with his faith. Things like premonitions. We've all heard of premonitions, about being able to predict things, about being able to see maybe when things happen. And some people believe in that, some people don't. Some people have personally experienced that, or I've been here before. But he writes about his premonitions. He writes about good and evil, and what it means to be good, and what it means to be evil. He writes about dark and light. He writes about subjects that are a little darker, like death, and maybe the coming of the end of things, and when his savior in his mind is going to come back, and maybe there'll be some kind of a redemption of some sort. But his books covered a lot of subjects like that, and they were all based on fiction. In other words, he was writing these books about theories and things that came into his head, and he would write these stories. But he also wrote children's books, and he wrote books for teenagers, and he wrote these books about adventures and then some crazy ideas about things that kids and teenagers get involved in. In about October of 2018, Chad was going out and he was invited by one of the witnesses that you'll hear in this case to speak about his books. And this was not uncommon. He would travel and he would be asked to say, well, come and talk about some of the things that you believe in. We've talked about these premonitions, some life experiences. You're going to hear testimony about that. And he was invited on one particular occasion in late October. And he attended this, and while he was there trying to sell his books, and like most of us who are business people, the focus of these meetings really was for Chad to try to get his books published, because that's how he made a living. And he was there in one of his booths trying to promote his books, and he laid them out there. And this beautifully stunning woman named Lori Vallow comes up. And she starts giving him a lot of attention. And she pursued him. And she encouraged him. And you'll hear testimony that she went so far as to grab behind the booth and sort of help him in trying to sell some of his books. She obviously had an interest, and maybe she felt that he was this publisher, or maybe she had an opinion. You'll hear testimony about that. And then after the seminar, there was a length of time where there was no contact between the two of them, a month and a half, 2 months. And during that time, Chad Daybell went on his day-to-day life. He'd been married to Tammy for some 29 years, has no remarkable background of any kind. I think the testimony we'll offer will show I think he had a speeding ticket in 2005. But Lori Vallow was a different story. Lori Vallow was someone who, right out of high school, married her first husband. You'll hear testimony about this. That marriage was very short-lived, very short-lived. She then married husband number 2 a few years later. And again, very short-lived marriage. And there's some testimony indication that there were some problems with the marriage that caused the breakup. But the concern seems to be, the theme seems to be that Lori's brother, Alex, and you're going to hear about Alex Cox. Alex Cox was Lori's protector. Alex Cox would do anything and everything to protect, aid, and assist Lori Vallow in whatever her endeavors, without unbridled question, anything. And if Alex Cox even perceived that there was a problem, Alex Cox reacted. You're going to hear testimony that in 2007, I believe it was in August of 2007, Lori Vallow had finished up going through her third marriage with Joseph Ryan. It was a tumultuous, you'll hear testimony that it was a tumultuous marriage, a terrible marriage. And Lori Vallow made accusations against Joseph Ryan of abusing their child, Tylee. Yes, the same Tylee. And during one of the visits in 2007, folks, and I want to tell you, you're going to hear testimony that in 2007, Chad Daybell didn't even know Lori Vallow existed. But Alex Cox, after one of the exchanges and the visitations with Tylee, Alex Cox approached Joseph Ryan and shot him with a taser and assaulted him. Was eventually charged with aggravated assault, was eventually put in jail, and had this on his record. And there was representation, the facts will suggest that at the time Joseph Ryan feared for his life. This was a serious situation. But it set the pattern for what we're dealing with Alex Cox. Whenever there was a problem or a threat to Lori Vallow, you'll hear testimony that Alex Cox came to the rescue. But Alex Cox would run without even question and do whatever was necessary to solve Lori Vallow's problems. We're going to fast forward then to 2019. Lori Vallow is still married to Charles Vallow. And the prosecuting attorney mentioned this, yes. Chad Daybell at that point, coming in January and February, started to have communications with Lori Vallow. And yes, folks, it turned into an inappropriate relationship. 2019 and forward. And yes, he was engaging in discussions. He was engaging in contact with her, all of the things that the prosecutor talked about in terms of a relationship. But subsequent to the seriousness of this relationship getting rolling, Alex Cox was at a visitation in 2019 with Charles Vallow. And Lori Vallow was there. Tylee Ryan was there. JJ was there. They were all present. And during that altercation and that supposed visit, much like with Joseph Ryan, Alex Cox took out a gun and shot Charles Vallow. And then after calling 911, he then finished the job and walked up to him at close range, finished him off. Now, you're going to hear testimony that in some way, Chad Daybell is implicated in that. And you're going to hear further testimony that he was not. You're going to hear testimony and see documentation that suggests that the prosecuting attorney on review of this indicated that there is no likelihood of conviction of Chad Daybell. You'll hear testimony that Chad Daybell had nothing to do with the execution by Alex Cox, Charles Vallow. And the same for Brandon Boudreaux. You will hear that Chad Daybell is not being pursued for any involvement in the Brandon Boudreaux attempted murder. Those occurred and those are separate, as well as the Charles Vallow. So what we have is we have a situation where someone who's 29 years old, Chad Daybell, 29 years of marriage with Tammy Daybell, no discernible issues in his life. And then Lori Vallow comes in the picture, Miss Texas. You'll hear testimony about this beautiful, vivacious woman, very sexual person, and very manipulative. And she knows how to get what she wants. And she drew Chad Daybell into a relationship, and an unfortunate relationship, that Chad fell into. After that, things started rolling, and issues started happening that eventually, yes, there was a murder and there was a burial. And you've heard discussion about the backyard of Chad Daybell. Well, we have a 4.5 acre farm in Fremont County, Idaho. And you'll hear testimony that the body of J.J. Vallow was discovered behind an irrigation pond and a tree out in the pasture. So technically, yes, maybe the backyard, but more accurately described as the pasture, hidden behind a tree. You're going to hear testimony that also in the middle of this pasture was a raspberry patch, former raspberry patch, that was then turned into a place for them to bury the cats, the dogs, and all of the animals on the farm. Okay? Again, out in the pasture of the field and not the backyard. You'll hear testimony about that. You're going to hear from 4 experts that I'm going to bring forward. And these 4 experts, the first one is going to be Dr. Greg Hampinkian. And Dr. Hampinkian is a bit of a notable local from Boise State University. And Dr. Hampinkian is a DNA expert, considered one of the best DNA experts. He's been involved and has significant work that he's done on both the defense and for the prosecution. He was involved and led the team with Amanda Knox in Italy that got her exonerated because of the DNA evidence. He has substantial experience. And anybody or anyone who knows anything about DNA goes to Dr. Hampinkian first, because he is the guy. And Dr. Hampinkian is going to talk a little bit about the DNA evidence that's found on the scene. Dr. Hampinkian is going to talk about the fingerprint on the plastic that J.J. Vallow was discovered in, was that of Alex Cox. Dr. Hampinkian is going to talk about the hair sample that was found on the plastic of Alex Cox, and that it was Lori Vallow. Dr. Hampinkian is going to talk about several, and I mean several other hairs that were found on the plastic of J.J. Vallow. But he's also going to say that there was no DNA evidence, no hair sample of Chad Daybell on Tylee Ryan or on J.J. Vallow. You're then going to hear from Dr. Raven. Dr. Raven is a forensic pathologist, and she's going to talk a little bit about the circumstances surrounding Tammy Daybell. And what Dr. Raven is going to say is that there's no indication that this is either a homicide or any other crime, and that the only conclusion she could come to is you can't determine what the cause of death was. There's no way to determine it. Tammy Daybell was buried. You'll hear testimony about that. And then a short time later, the police officers showed up and they dug her body up after she'd been buried, after she was laid to rest, and then continued after the body was pulled out of the ground and continued to examine it for whatever they were looking for. And what you're going to find is based on that, Dr. Raven's going to say you can't determine what the cause of death is. You're going to hear testimony from the Daybell children, from the children themselves. 4 of the 5 children, I think, three or 4 of the 5 children testimony. They're going to talk about their mother's health struggles. They're going to talk about their mother's use of various medicinal treatments that she would use, oils that she would put on her leg, medicine and different herbs that she would take, and that her mother was suffering from, a number of maladies, and that she would refuse to go see a doctor or get it treated. And Dr. Raven's going to enlighten you a little bit about some of the circumstances regarding Tammy Daybell. You're then going to hear from Patrick Eller. He's a forensic digital data examiner. And Patrick Eller is someone who has spent his life in the military working for various agencies, and we'll talk a little bit about that, within the government to do data retrieval and data research. And he's going to talk a little bit about the phone records that are involved in this case. He's going to specifically talk about the travels of Alex Cox, because you are going to hear testimony that Alex Cox went to Chad Daybell's property on the 9th of September. You're going to hear that Alex Cox approached Chad Daybell's property a half a dozen other, 5 or 6 other times. You're going to hear testimony that Alex Cox was there on the 23rd. And you're going to hear where Alex Cox was in a number of other times and places in his whereabouts and his travels for about a 2.5 month period. And Patrick is going to, offer you some information and data to support all of that. And finally, you're going to hear from a forensic anthropologist, and his name's Eric Bartolink. And Mr. Bartolink is going to talk to you a little bit about the nature and the nature of how the remains of Tylee were burned. Eric Bartolink is going to talk to you a little bit about the lack of complete skeletal remains and why, when Tylee was dug down in the ground, there was not a complete set of skeletal remains. In fact, there were a number of pieces of that were missing. You're going to hear a lot of evidence, and the judge has talked to us a little bit about not making a decision until you hear all of the evidence. And there's a specific jury instruction that talks about that. The jury instruction is, consider all the evidence. Listen to the instructions from the court on how you're to proceed. Listen to the arguments of the prosecuting attorney and the defense. And then and only then do you make your decision. And at the conclusion of all that evidence, and at the conclusion of the judge's instructions, the arguments of both of the defense attorneys, I'm going to ask you folks to return the verdict not guilty. Thank you, folks. Thank you for your time.
We have been watching opening statements in the murder trial for Chad Daybell. We are going to be here with you inside the courtroom, and we are going to bring you all of the information, kind of that insight into what's being said on the stand, why witnesses are called, what they are offering the jury, what the jury might be hearing and listening for. We're going to bring you all of that insight and information here on Inside the Courtroom. So as you watch along, KTVB.com, we will be sharing all of this trial with you. using those cameras inside the courtroom because Judge Boyce has allowed us that access. It's allowing public access to this trial. So as you watch along, send us your questions. If you want more information about a specific piece of this trial, we want to know about it. So please do text us, send us that information, ask us those questions, and we will bring you those answers here on Inside the Courtroom. Until next time, thank you very much for joining us.